Good morning, everyone. Our first panel this morning is portfolio planning and investment. I'd like to ask our panelists to come on up. See Brian, Chad. All right, so as they come up, so our first discussion this morning is among PBS assistant and regional commissioners addressing questions and concerns submitted by customer agencies. So hopefully you're going to get some answers to some questions you all have. As our panelists get settled, note that at the bottom of the mic, there is a button that will mute it. Please don't touch it. It's very sensitive. They will mute it at the top, but we had some issues yesterday with the mics not being heard. But if your light is green, you are good to go. All right, so I'm going to quickly ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves before we dive in. Do you mind if I start with you?
Good morning, I'm Chad Gilchrist. I'm the Acting Assistant Commissioner for Portfolio Management and Customer Engagement.
Good morning, I'm Joanna Rosato. I'm the Regional Commissioner in the Mid-Atlantic region in Philadelphia.
Good morning, Crofton Whitfield, and I'm the Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Leasing.
Good morning, Melanie Gilbert. I am the Regional Commissioner for the National Capital Region. Please be kind. This is the start of my 9th month in this job.
My name is Brian Key. I'm the Chief of Staff for the Office of Real Property Disposition, recently known as Real Property Disposal.
All right, thanks everybody. We're really happy to have you all here this morning. So let's start off talking about the GSA National Portfolio Plan. Chad, do you mind explaining to the audience what the National Portfolio Planning effort is?
Absolutely. So about 18 months ago, we started on a campaign to really get to the foundation of principles of asset management. We wanted to analyze the entire owned inventory, the owned inventory, approximately 170 million square feet, and every asset within it, every owned asset that we had against a variety of factors, condition, vacancy, performance, and cost. And what we did with that information was rank every asset on a grade of 1 to 5, essentially. Those 1s being long-term holds that score well on each of those attributes, and the 5s being assets that might be more likely for a disposition or a repositioning, given they're either underwater financially or poorly performing or have a poor facility condition. And what we can do with that information on the supply side of the equation is really begin to analyze which assets are good long-term holds, assets that are sound investments and sound reinvestments, and assets on the other end of the spectrum that might need to find higher and better use than serving the federal inventory. Beyond that, there's some assets in the middle that the commissioner likes to refer to as the murky middle sometimes. And that murky middle is a slew of assets where we've got a lot of work to do both internally and in partnership with customers to really understand what the future use of those assets might be. Now, the challenge here for us is collectively in the real estate enterprise is that those factors that I mentioned are based on an analysis of data that GSA really has solid access to. What we don't have good access to is information about, from a data perspective. Of course, we have an understanding in our work with customers, but we don't have a data set that's as discrete as those factors that I mentioned on how well or how poorly those assets are meeting customer mission. How well are those assets configured to modern use for within the interior of those spaces to fit the work that you're all doing within that space. We also don't have great information from a data set perspective on utilization. We have very good information on vacancy, but vacancy tells us very little about the actual daily utilization of that space, how many humans are in that space on a day-to-day basis versus how many humans that space was designed for. And that demand side of the equation is critical to our work as partners in optimizing and modernizing the inventory. If you heard the commissioner speak yesterday, you heard about that vision of fewer buildings and better buildings. Knowing that we can't carry the costs of this relatively massive inventory that's almost 50 years on average, 50 years old on average. Space that likely doesn't, more often than not, likely doesn't meet customer agency mission. Space that more often than not is too costly to operate and maintain. And space that could, on the other end of the spectrum, if we reduced the size of the inventory, reduced our operating costs and our carrying costs, we could reinvest those savings into the inventory to modernize them, to meet the needs of the 21st century mission, to attract and retain top talent, as you heard in perhaps the first panel yesterday from Andrea Neal and from OPM. And with that vision of fewer buildings, better buildings, really looking to reposition the entire inventory in a way that that is suited for the next century of work. That's so important. So we can talk a little bit more about that, but that's the foundation of what we worked on for the national portfolio planning process.
Thanks, Chad. So as GSA is repositioning its assets and thinking differently, Joanna, how is the customer mission being taken into account as these repositionings are happening as part of the national plan?
So what Chad described at the national level starts locally at the regional level with an evaluation of what customers need. Anecdotally, we haven't really gone out to customers formally in many cases on their needs, just knowing what's coming due, leases that are expiring in the market, and occupancies in our federal buildings. Most cities around the country were developed for the federal workforce back in the 60s and 70s, and those buildings, some of them have been updated, some of them have not. And we need to evaluate those at the local level in terms of what the market conditions are and what the customer needs would be. So the national portfolio plan took into account those local markets. Each region has a handful. If you're in a region like Chicago, I think there's like 6 or 7 major markets in that region. But you could draw a circle around the major cities in those regions and the federal buildings around them. And then from that circle, get to the customers that are in those buildings and in those leases. We need to determine what the 5-year, 10-year plan is for customers, and then how that factors into building conditions and the market. In some cases, it might be better to be in the lease market than it might be to be in the federal building, where we can get lease space fairly cheaply and get you Class A space. Sadly, some of those 60s and 70s buildings wouldn't be classified as Class A office space. And that's really the commissioner's mantra of fewer buildings, better buildings, and to give you the most optimal space for today's workforce. Some of those buildings were constructed to hold major filing systems that we don't have anymore, thousands of people that aren't in cities anymore. So we're really anxious to hear from you what your plans are for those local markets so that we can factor that into our lease portfolio and to the owned portfolio. And that we can highlight those buildings that we know are the core assets in those markets and start to shuffle the deck a little bit about how to optimize those buildings and get money to repair and modernize them.
Thanks, Joanna. So we've heard a lot about the leased portfolio and the federally owned portfolio. So Brian, is GSA able to help reposition assets owned by customer agencies?
Sure. We have offer a variety of services and tools to help agencies reposition or dispose of assets. My office basically acts as the disposal agent for GSA and much of the federal government. But beyond just disposal services itself, we also can help customer agencies kind of take a look at their assets, do a deep dive on what they have, what it can be used for, what's the future use for it, and what can be done with that asset. But our main role is as a disposal agent, and in that capacity, we kind of act as transactional managers or brokers throughout the disposition process. We have quite a lot of experience. We probably do on average about 100 dispositions a year nationwide, wide variety of asset types across many different agencies. And we like to kind of start early engagement with customers. What does the asset, what do we own? Do we have marketable title? And what's the path to regulatory closure with our environmental issues, historic preservation or historic compliance issues, the local or specific stakeholder issues that make that property kind of unique or difficult to navigate some of those challenges. So, but ultimately we see these dispositions through from the very beginning all the way to when they're out of federal inventory. We kind of get with the agency, again, see what we have, see what the local market is like, see what the impediments to disposition are, and kind of chart a path to kind of get to that final disposition. And that path includes, exploring the services and tools we need to get there. One of those tools is actually disposal authority itself. So we, within GSA, we have a disposal authority under the Property Act. My office is appropriated to do that work. So there's no RWA required. We do all that work. We're already funded for it. Some of our customer agencies have their own disposal authority. And, they may want to use that. It may be more suitable for the asset. Their authority may provide more flexibility, or it may give them access to the proceeds or some other reason why they'd like to use that. And we can use that disposal authority as well. In that case, we would require an RWA. I think one of the hardest parts of the disposition process, a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of complexity is, of course, the regulatory compliance. We have a lot of experience. We have some of the best environmental experts in our staff, as well as those in the historic preservation laws and processes. So we can help navigate those and kind of strategically take a look at how we're going to close out and get to regulatory closure on those steps so we can move on forward with the disposal process. And then the disposal process itself, stakeholder management is obviously key in all that we do. I think it's particularly important when we're offloading or disposing of federal property. Sometimes that impacts the local community in a lot of ways. So early outreach, transparency, discussion with the local communities, the local government, the state regulatory bodies, state government, industry, that's all a key part, a central part of what we do when we dispose of properties. Because otherwise, wrenches could get thrown in at the last minute and really delay things more than they really need to be. In that final stage of disposition, usually finally the property goes to sale. We have a lot of tools available to help make that sale successful. We have BPA we leverage to get marketing assistance from the private sector. All sorts of open houses, industry days. We have a dedicated online sales site. We usually do online auctions, but we do sealed bids as well, and in other cases, different types of sales. And we're experienced at drafting up sales contracts for those properties with any deed restrictions that might be required for a lot of the federal properties we deal with. And ultimately, of course, handling all the money and all that sort of things as well. But outside of disposition itself, we also offer other services, appraisals, land use studies, highest and best use studies. We have something called a targeted asset review, which is a really deep dive into an asset. So if an agency is unsure or unclear what the future is for that asset, whether they want to retain it, invest in it, or dispose of it, this targeted asset review, again, takes a deep dive, looks at how it's used, how it furthers the mission, what's the possible future use for it, what are the impediments to a possible disposition, of what needs to happen in that case. And there's another broad variety of services under the BPAs we can help with as well. And then finally, I do want to add, we offer customizable workshops. Those are usually 2 or 3 day workshops for landholding agencies, and they kind of go over all things federal real property disposition. Anything from the laws, like obviously stuff like NEPA, the regulatory issues, valuation issues, case studies on stakeholder management, and a whole variety of other aspects as well. And again, that's customizable. So we have a lot of good feedback on those workshops. It kind of gives the tools or helps some of our federal customers understand what they're dealing with in the disposition process.
Thanks, Brian. So switching gears a little bit to space optimization, Crofton, what is GSA's leasing strategy as it works to optimize the federal footprint given the current market conditions?
Right, so with GSA, we have a total of about 7,500 leases. And we used to have the ability to say that in most leases, we would be in a particular lease for anywhere between 17 and 22 years on average. So in the past, that supported our strategy for going long with a lot of our leases for a very long time. You know, we said, hey, this is a valuable asset in the market or valuable leverage in the market to be able to do longer term leases. So most of our leases would go on for about that term, you know, on average 17 to 22 years. At this point, GSA has kind of rethought kind of our strategy based on, you know, everything that we have, the new environment that we're in, and really thinking about, you know, what is the right term, you know, so instead of just going long on every procurement and every action, we're really working with the agencies to come up with what is your right term and marrying kind of that agency requirement and tie it directly to what that lease strategy is. So we do smart term leasing. We want to make sure that, you know, we are providing the agencies the space that they need for no longer than we need it. So we want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to mirror whatever the agency's need is. Based on that, I think a lot of folks think, you know, we've been hearing back from the industry that means that we're just going to do short-term leases all the time everywhere. And that's not really what we're looking at doing. I've just signed off on a number of leases that are 20 years plus, because there are some agencies that will remain in their space for that firm period. Some agencies are not, don't have the need for that longer term because they're reevaluating what their long-term strategy is. And so we have to be flexible, responsible, and responsive to everything that they're looking for in terms of their long-term space needs, their housing needs. Chad talked a little bit about you know, the national portfolio plan. All of this is really kind of tied into that as well. So we want to make sure that whatever we do, we're supporting those local portfolio plans as well as the national portfolio planning. So we're doing everything that we can to work directly with our agencies in a smart way to make sure that we're not buying more space or renting more space than we need or staying for longer than we need it. So we'll continue to work with Chad and Joanna's team to make sure that we're making sure that we have those right terms.
And Crofton, you've got a great data point on a couple of transactions that shifted from a 20-year term to a 10-year term and what the impact on cost was. Do you want to reveal what we found from the market on that?
Sure. So we've had a couple of initiatives, GSA, that we kind of put into place, just some guardrails to kind of do a pulse check to make sure that we're evaluating the right deals and that we're getting the best bang for the buck for the government. And one of the things that we were doing was when we got a prospectus level lease, we would go out to the market for those 20 years without going back and sometimes checking with the agency. Once we checked with the agency, we were able to find that the agency said, hey, we want to go 10 years instead of 20. So we have this 20-year authority, but we're only going to use 10 years of it. And that made a lot of sense. Our concern was that once we went back to the lessor, that the lessor would then say, hey, you're not staying for longer, I'm going to increase your rates. But that was not the case. We have an extreme amount of leverage here if we use it in a very collaborative way with our customers so that we can partner and we can come up with the best deal. So we were still able to get the exact same rate for a 10-year deal that we initially thought we need for 20 years. So good work. That's good collaboration.
Thanks. So we heard from Crofton, as well as we heard a lot yesterday, that the reality of space now is hybrid. We're hybrid today, right? We have our virtual participants. We've got here some people here in person. Chad and Joanna, I'd love to hear from you all about what tools and programs does GSA have that agencies can take advantage of now to help begin the process of thinking about hybrid space?
So a variety of tools that we're pretty proud of, and you can check them out. We'll share some links with from our website with details on all these. And if I miss any, please correct me. But we've got the WIFM tool, which we heard about yesterday. That's right. It looks like we've got a cheat sheet up here. We're placing investment feasibility model.
So tied to acronyms, we don't even know what it is.
That's right. Nina refers to it as the "What's in it for me" tool, which made me think that we should also develop the maybe the workplace telework feasibility model, the WTF model. But that one didn't sink in. Yeah. So we've got federal co-working, which we piloted in the Workplace Innovation Lab, that notion of like the federal version of a WeWork or a liquid space that you can reserve for a long period of time or a short period of time. There is the Fast Track Space tool, which is a series of, it's essentially a design prototype with a couple of different, it's a kit of parts approach where you can block together a space plan, significantly cutting down on design time. Think about, Vicky always uses the analogy of when you're buying a home, you can, buy the McPherson model or the McAllister model. They're not all Scottish, but those are the ones that just popped to my head, unfortunately, at the outset. Fast Track Space, another tool to quickly get into space. AAAP, a popular leasing tool, of course, where lessors essentially sign up and say, we've got this space available and it's ready to go. Let me know when you want to order it. Do you want to share in some others?
So the Workplace Innovation Lab is certainly the greatest tool that we have for people to try out space. But if you're not in the DC area, many of our regional offices have similar space. And we found that sometimes we've had like agency unions come and work in our space to kind of get a feel for what collaborative space looks like before, try before you buy kind of thing. And we have many of the federal co-working locations cropping up across the country in Denver, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Chicago. So if you're not in the DC area and you want to try a different type of space, your local GSA office can help you with that.
Okay. So switching gears, and we're going to talk a little bit about the GAO report, but before we dive in, I just want to give a warning. We are going to ask for audience questions. So for folks in the virtual audience, as well as folks in the room, start those gears turning. So once I ask a few questions about the GAO report, I'd like to open the floor a little bit, just so people can start thinking about it. So let's dive into the GAO report. So Chad, what is GSA's plan to engage with agencies in order to determine the demand side of the HQ equation?
Well, I'll sort of lay the foundation of some of the findings, and I'd love to pitch it over to Melanie to talk a little bit about next steps for the NCR, National Capital Region. GAO did a report, a study on HQ utilization for CFO Act agencies. It feels like old news now, but it's only been out for like a week and a half. They submitted as part of their testimony to the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee a week and a half ago. And what they did is collect daily occupancy data for all 24 CFO headquarters buildings for 1 week each in 3 months, February, March, and April. And what they found was, not surprisingly, I mean, we've all walked the space, right? What they found was that 71% of agencies, so 71% of those spaces were occupied less than a quarter of their design capacity. So they had 75% more space than they needed. So that's 71% of the headquarters space. What about the other 29%? Was that 80% occupied, 90% occupied? No, it was at most 50% occupied, all the way down to about 28%. So what we found was there is a lot of value to mine, but we all know the challenges of the configuration of that space, of perhaps the way it was designed. It could be a hallway with glass windows with a wall that just makes those the spaces proximate to those windows all offices with no open floor plan, with no ability to be flexible in how the space is used. So while I think there was some trepidation in the real estate world, I think all of us thinking like, oh, there's about to be a bombshell dropped. The bombshell was also not a surprise, and it, I think, refocuses us on the opportunity to mine value. We've got, from a GSA perspective, $11 billion worth of revenue that we collect that's supposed to be reinvested into that inventory. So if we could shave 10% of the inventory off, that's $1 billion. If we could shave 30% off, that's $3 billion a year. And it's actually more than that when you think about the holding costs of real estate. multiple studies have shown that the most expensive portion of the life cycle of assets is not the construction or even major R&A, it's just the sustainment, the O&M period of those assets. So trillions of dollars at stake from the underutilization. And I think Melanie's well poised to talk about what that means specifically for headquarters in the National Capital Region.
Well, as the regional commissioner running the National Capital Region and the team that is responsible for all the headquarters locations that were studied in the GAO report, our job is to work with all of you and to figure out what space you really do need in your headquarters. I mean, there are multiple challenges, as Chad alluded to. One, it's sort of Swiss cheese. You in these places, you have different pockets of utilization. Is there a way to sort of compress those holes in the buildings in order to gain some efficiency, to co-locate another agency, to look at your component agencies, to bring them into the headquarters buildings? How do we break this notion that this is mine, this is no one else's? Every dollar that an agency spends on rent, if you got rid of that rent dollar, you could spend on mission. When I was with the federal courts for 30 years, this is something that we took very seriously. Budgets are going to be constrained. Money is not going to be flowing. The debt ceiling bills, all of those things. I think that it's the moment in time where each of you, as the real estate leaders for your agencies, need to really look at this hard. It's not easy and it takes money. And that's part of what GSA wants to do, is to partner with you to find those projects, to really think holistically about the portfolio. Part of this also is some of these federal assets need serious maintenance. A lot of deferred maintenance in these buildings. It's hard to convince someone to get out of a nice shiny lease and into a federal building where the chillers aren't working every day. That is a huge challenge for us at the national level, at the regional level, and we think all the time about how to tackle that. I think the days of doing these massive modernizations of State Department or of Commerce, where we phased it, or DOT, whatever the building is, I just don't think we're there. I don't think Congress is going to give us the money to do that. And so we need to think creatively about how to get that money to do these projects and prioritize at the regional level for all of you to make these federal assets a place where the other component agencies would want to come. So, and we're going to talk a little bit more about utilization, and I think, but that's really where we're headed. We want to work with you. We need to work with the national client executives for each of your agencies, with the executive sponsors for each of your agencies. And in order to just really think long and hard about what GAO said, to do what's right for the taxpayers.
Thank you both. So we are going to talk about space utilization, but before we go there, just giving an opportunity quickly, because we've covered a couple topics. Do we have any questions in the room? We have a gentleman in the back. We've got a microphone runner who will come by so everyone can hear you.
And the first question asker actually gets to use that F-150 to do some donuts out on the mall. Interior is allowed for us to do
I was
that.
kind of hoping for the Mustang, but I'll settle for the F-150. Steve Daigle, Customs and Border Protection. Actually, you guys are generating a lot of questions in my mind. Chad, you touched on the aging federal buildings. And a lot of us are, when you're in a federal building, it would take an act of God to get out of the federal building. But yet what I hear you saying is also that GSA may be trying to downsize that inventory, which a lot of it is on the historical register, and it just, what is the true feasibility of that? And I ask this question because a lot of times when we try to move into a federal building that is aged, there's the cost of abatement that is added on to that, the build out cost of that area. So one, can you truly get rid of those aged buildings? Because I think, to your point, there are some of the, not the LA, Chicago, New York areas where you go out and the lease is probably more expensive. But in some of the other remote areas where we have this aging infrastructure, to your point, is that truly feasible? And how would that transition work to those that are actually in that federal workspace?
It's a great question. So what we know is since freeze the footprint and reduce the footprint, the federal real estate portfolio has reduced over the last decade by about 45 million square feet. And within the GSA inventory portion of that, that's all land holding agencies was the first 45. The GSA portion of that, about 10 million square feet of space. And so we know how to dispose, we know how to reposition assets. And we've also shown that the federal government, while an effective steward of assets on the historic register, that's not necessarily the only way to take care of historic assets or assets that have strategic historic importance. That universities and hotels and other entities can make effective and even the highest and best use of historic assets. So we've got a good track record in that regard, not to minimize the challenge in any way, because you're absolutely right. I think another aspect of this that we want to mention is that there's no one size fits all answer to that sort of asset ranking and own versus lease analysis, because it depends on the market and it depends on the demand for the asset. And it depends on an alternatives analysis or net present value about what the right solution is for the government at that asset. So if you have a federally owned asset that's got $300 million worth of liabilities and maybe it's 80% utilized, and you can lease in that market for 18 bucks a square foot, 19 bucks a square foot, it might make the most sense to get out of the federal asset, actually, allow the taxpayers to recoup some value from the sale of that asset, hopefully reinvest that money back into the inventory, but also get into some Class A or some trophy space through that leasing solution in that softer market. So it's going to depend on market. It's going to depend on the asset. Again, not a one size fits all solution, but we've got the pieces to do this and a track record to show that we can. There are some pieces of the puzzle that are missing. I mentioned recouping the savings or the value from disposal back into the inventory. That's a big piece that we don't have right now. We don't have the ability to immediately have access to those funds from disposal to reinvest, to mine the opportunity for the next move and consolidation. As we've been saying lately on the Hill, it takes money to save money. So we'd like to, and we have proposals and discussions with Congress to have access both to that disposal revenue, but also to the revenue that we collect in the form of rent. As former customers, and Steve, I don't know that we had the privilege to work together. I worked at CBP for 14 years up until 2008. But as former customers, Melanie and I are unfortunately all too used to being familiar with the circumstance of paying rent into the federal buildings fund and seeing that as the place where rent money goes to die, where that money is not reinvested back into the inventory. And as a customer, I would have happily paid my rent bill. I'd have happily paid more for my rent bill if I knew that I had space that was supporting my mission. That's not the setup right now. Congress devised this federal buildings fund to work as a quasi-revolving fund. But unfortunately, it's not working that way because Congress has figured out in the last decade or so that you can use the deposits in the fund for offsets to go do other things across the federal enterprise that aren't real estate. And result has been, we've got a foundational shift where the money that's supposed to be reinvested into the inventory is not. And under the formulas where we look at reinvestment in buildings, I think everybody's familiar with the benchmark of spending 2 to 4% of functional replacement value into your inventory. That sort of assumes that your asset has a 25 to 50-year useful life that, generally speaking, that's in the ballpark. Right now, the reinvestment that Congress is making into the inventory, look at the last couple of budget years, look at this House and Senate mark for this year, they're assuming that these assets have a 200-year useful life. We're getting $500 million annually for major RNA when we should be getting $4 billion. Billion. Billions, not millions. So while we have a track record of disposing and leasing where we should lease and owning where we should lease, there's a foundational fix that needs to be made with the Hill. And we're blessed to have legitimate like ledge proposals that have White House support, and they made it into the president's budget, and they're up there on the Hill now, which is a milestone. That's never been the case, but we need to get it across the finish line. So thanks for that question.
And if I may, yeah, in terms of the properties on the historic registry or eligible for registry, we have, as Chad says, a track record of success. Now, those disposing of those properties is complex, right? The regulatory compliance involves a lot of consulting parties. There's a lot of care, as there should be, in how to maintain aspects of that asset that are historic. But it can be done. It is difficult, of course, but we have a lot of folks who have experienced doing that. And secondly, on the proceeds from disposals, some agencies have retention of proceeds. So when we sell one of their properties, they get back all those net proceeds. But just like PBS, most of them can't spend that money until they get approval from Congress or authority from Congress. So one reform we've been advocating for a long time now, and it seems like it's starting to get some traction, but it's hard to really know what's going to happen, is allowing agencies to retain those proceeds and spend those not subject to a further appropriation, because that will incentivize kind of the right behavior, and it'll incentivize agencies to kind of dispose of properties faster. And quite frankly, they should get the money back. Any other realty organization would, just like the rent, they would take money that they get on selling a property and put it back towards the rest of their inventory. So I will see what happens with that, but it is a reform that we've been advocating pretty strongly in kind of every avenue and every opportunity we have.
Thanks, Brian and Chad. I know we have a virtual question.
This question is from our online guest today. They want to know if you can predict, will there be retrofit funding from Congress to support and assist agencies with downsizing or right-sizing space?
So that consolidation, that funding for that aspect of what we're needing is foundational. Again, without, I'll say it again, it takes money to save money. And what we've seen historically within PBS's budget requests over the last 20 years is that there was a lot of new construction activity in those requests. I do anticipate that we're going to be taking a more take care of the inventory that you have approach, and look for major plus ups to a couple of line items that help us with consolidation activities. Both, I'll get wonky for a second. We have a special emphasis program called the consolidation program. I suspect that we'll be working with Congress to invest more heavily in that area so that we can mine value in the inventory and get to a smaller footprint, fewer buildings and better buildings. I also suspect that we will be working with Congress to see more funding in our minor repairs and alterations account, which is the account for PBS. We call it BA 54. This is the wonky part of the discussion. Many of you are familiar with that. That's the account that's subject to prospectus limitations. So year over year, Congress generally better funds our minor repair and alterations program than it does our major, but it's only about $350, $400 million a year annually. And that's not enough across a total inventory of 380 million square feet. So we would like to see a couple of things on the minor repair and alteration side that would help us maximize those consolidation dollars. In short, being higher levels investment for minor R&A and an increase to the prospectus threshold to $10 million, so that we have the flexibility to work more quickly with customer agencies to identify need and quickly execute against that need, as opposed to going through a prospectus cycle that mirrors the budget cycle, which, like, the difference being today we identify a need with a customer. A month from now, we've got a contract out on the street, an RFP out on the street to execute that work because we've got the money in hand already. The difference in the above prospectus universe is we identify a need today with a customer. We put that in the cycle. If today, for instance, we're in the FY26 cycle. So we'll see in 3 years when we're trying to do that thing that will now be obsolete.
Some of the most successful prospectuses included lease consolidations and other aspects of space where we need your help So where you can streamline the need and we can justify the lease savings in the market, that has been the precursor to us getting some major dollars for modernizations of federal buildings. So that all goes back to those local portfolio plans and the national portfolio plan and how we're going to strategize to maximize that use of the building. So when we come to you with these housing strategies, it's really important. We've seen a lot of success where we've been able to reduce our need in the lease market to justify the maintenance of a federal building.
And I'm just going to pile on here for a second and say in delegated buildings where many of you have those headquarters that are delegated, you're doing space projects now, you're doing consolidation, you're doing workplace of the future projects. We need to partner with you to have a better sense of what those projects are so that we can work together on that asset. And again, get rid of the Swiss cheese in the building and trying to thinking a little bit more holistically. So that's my plug from the NCR perspective.
Thank you, everybody. Any other questions from the audience?
Thank you. David Jordan with the courts. A question that sort of relates to your success story in the leasing going from 20 years to 10 years. What can customers do to better communicate their requirements to you? Because a pivot from 20 to 10 after you've already approached the lessor seems a little late news. And if GSA is looking for the ability to quickly respond to market opportunities, if a customer goes in for 20 and doesn't need it, how thoroughly are the customers thinking out their program, and what can GSA do to help motivate that thinking for agencies that don't do this very often?
Great. All right. I'll start and then ask Chad if he wants to jump in. But I'll say one of the things that we found, like I said, when we were doing kind of this pulse check, was that many customers hadn't rethought their requirements since the initial project was approved. And the example that I talked about was a project that was provided a prospectus approval on the Hill, which is done typically within like about 5 years before the lease expires. So we'd had that authority and that agency had that discussion with GSA prior to the environment changing. And so we were in the middle of just executing the project as normal, which we want to kind of continue the work and make sure that we're, getting the best deal, and we were still going long. We had to have, I think, a more deliberate conversation with a lot of the agencies that had these types of projects that were already, where the requirements were already agreed upon prior to the pandemic. And then we had deliberate discussions about what do we need to go forward with, what makes sense at this moment. And that's when they were able to stop and say, hey, you know what, maybe we don't need 20 years, maybe we only need 10 years. And we were still able to go in some cases and negotiate option years, which go beyond kind of the 20 years, so that if they need the additional time, it allows GSA and the government flexibility in the market to either exercise that option or not. So we're doing everything that we can in a thoughtful way, in a way to partner with all of you, our customers, so that we better understand your requirements. And then we'll find whatever tools we have in our toolkit to meet that need. And that's really kind of where the partnership goes. And I know Chad's group does a lot with requirements at the headquarters level, and also just helps to allow us to execute on some of these lease deals. So yeah, Chad, Joanne.
So you don't need to wait till your lease term expires to start thinking about this. We've had great examples of agencies who've come to us in the middle of their lease term and said, I'm not using all this space, I need to downsize. We took advantage of the soft term or renegotiate with the lessor to do something different. So it's not a life sentence with no opportunity for parole when you're in a lease. There's different ways that we can manage that and save you money and reconfigure. So if you're looking at your requirements now and saying this is too much and I'm paying too much on the leases, we really need to look at that and see what we can take advantage of either within the terms of the lease or with some kind of superseding action. But it can be done, and we're saving money in a lot of places like that.
Well said. I think the point is communication is key. We want to hear about your needs for space, whether they're more space or less space. at any point in the process, whether it's a lease or whether it's a federal asset, whether we're, at step one in the 36-month advance work for a new lease acquisition or replacement lease, or whether it's, if it's month 35 and your needs change, we want to know so that we can figure out what to do about it. And the point is, none of our actions are going to be arbitrary. It's not about just sticking to 20 years. It's not about just sticking to 10. It's about managing risk, understanding your needs, and the level of certainty that you have for those needs so that we can develop a risk management approach around it. Option years are a great example, especially if we're getting the same deals at 10 years as we are at 20. You can have a 10-year firm and a couple of options that allow us to go further if we need to. So talk to your regional account manager, your national account manager, talk to your building manager, your asset manager. We're positioning all of GSA to understand this message that we want to mine the value of the portfolio, whether it's owned or leased, so that we can slice through that Swiss cheese and make the best use of taxpayer dollars and get you the best space for your mission.
Great. I think I saw one more hand up. If not, right over here.
Hello, my name is Joseph Lofton. I'm with the National Labor Relations Board. I guess I have two questions. You guys mentioned that you have assets like these co-working spaces with WeWork and other GSA co-working spaces like the one upstairs. I'm wondering, how do those assets play into strategies for headquarters spaces that are trying to reduce space? And then my second question is, I guess what I'm hearing from the panel is that GSA that really doesn't have a target number for reduction of square footage spaces, and if it really is dependent on the needs of the headquarters or agency needs as far as it goes with reduction of space.
Sure. Yeah. So on the federal co-working side first, well, I'll take a step back on co-working writ large. We have federal co-working space opportunities, which would be a co-working environment in a federally owned asset, like we have on the second floor here in the Workplace Innovation Lab that we're expanding across the country in regional office buildings. And then we have some IDIQ contracts set up with Liquid Space and WeWork and other co-working space providers that can be tapped. Honestly, I think that whatever of those solutions meet your needs best is best for you, but I'm more excited about the federal co-working space, quite frankly, because it allows us to maximize the value of the inventory that we have, and it allows customer agencies to try it out with less risk. I mean, right now you can try it out for free. How's that for no risk? And the opportunity there is for you to figure out as an agency, well, actually, I don't need this, this 100,000 square feet, 250,000 square foot lease in this area because my folks are only going in 2 days a week or on an as needed basis. And when we do that, there's conference space in this federal co-working space that we can use. And it meets our needs, and we can actually get rid of our entire 250,000 square foot, whether it's a lease posture or an own posture, and just collapse into that co-working space, which is just a profound idea to think about the opportunities there. Or it could mean maybe your 250,000 square foot is spread over 3 floors, and you can go from 2 floors down to 1 and have the co-working space as flex space. There's so many opportunities there to mine value and to work in ways that, as the commissioner was mentioning yesterday, are more attractive to the emerging workforce that's more diverse and educated than any in previous generations. So it can be part of a multi-pronged strategy for people, technology, and space. So co-working was the first part of your question. And then the second part of your question was?
The second part of my question was GSA really doesn't have a target for reduction of space.
We don't have targets, but we're excited about getting there collectively as a community. So if you think about the numbers that we just talked about earlier on the GAO study of headquarters buildings, some agencies are starting to set targets. I don't want to call any agency out, but some agencies have, and you know who you are. And if you want to speak up and talk about that, or let us know in the future how robustly you wouldn't mind us talking about it, that's great. I think the opportunity is really in the general purpose office space environment. administrative space. And if you think about 71% of agencies only using 25% of the existing space, there's value there to be mined. Let's pretend though that the pandemic didn't happen, which would be beautiful for a variety of reasons. Pretend that the pandemic didn't happen. Rewind to 2018. How much space was underutilized back then? Story is different for each agency. What we know about a couple of buildings, a representative sample of multi-purpose or multi-tenant federal buildings, is that they were on their busiest days only 70% utilized, which meant that there was still 30% of the space to be mined there for savings or reconfiguration or a different solution. So targets have not been set by GSA. Some agencies have set them. I think we're interested in identifying some targets as a federal enterprise. The what if scenarios. What if we reduce 10% of the space, a general purpose office space? What if we agreed that as a general purpose office space reduction, we could target 30%? Doesn't mean every agency is reducing by 30%. Maybe some agencies are reducing by 60 or 70%. Some agencies are reducing by 10. Some agencies are reducing by nothing. Again, in the office space environment, I'm not talking about lab space or mission specific space or courtrooms or courthouses in that regard. So much to be mined there. And I think we've run the numbers, if you eliminate 30% of general purpose office space, we could reduce the GSA owned inventory by about 70 million square feet and have a cost avoidance over 10 years of about $50 billion. That's something. And we have that opportunity right now.
I'm just going to piggyback on that for a second from the NCR perspective. GSA, these co-working spaces, these are tools that GSA has created, a toolbox for each of you to look at what are creative ways to meet your space needs. So second thing, types of spaces are not all equal. And we recognize that. But as Chad said, the vanilla office space, the, coming in 2 days a pay period, that kind of space, I think you can get a lot more savings out of, or at least squeeze that more than your specialized space. And I think we all recognize that. As far as targets, no, we're not setting them, but Congress is awfully interested in this, as is OMB. So I think agencies have a responsibility to start looking hard at their space. And the last thing I'll say is, again, every dollar you save in rent is a dollar you can use for mission. And as budgets become more and more constrained, I think those are the really hard decisions that you all need to be making. And we are here, GSA, as your partner to try and help you navigate those decisions.
So we've kind of naturally transitioned into this utilization conversation. So let's pick up there. So Melanie, what are some of the obstacles agencies encounter in their HQ planning efforts?
Well, I would ask you, what are some of the obstacles that you are, finding? I think from the work that our regional client executives are doing in the National Capital Region with the national client execs, your culture, 1, 2, your telework policy, 3, your union acceptance of your telework policy. I've seen some building. I've tried to get out and walk as many headquarters buildings as I can, many to go, but met so many great people in this audience, talking about these issues. And sometimes you're challenged with not only different buildings have different policies, but different floors in different buildings have different policies depending on the unions and that's really hard. But again, just because it's hard doesn't mean it's not doable. That is my motto. And we have a responsibility to do this. Lack of funding, huge challenge. I know for you, definitely for us. In the fewer buildings, better buildings. Again, that's why we're really hoping we get full funding to the Federal Buildings Fund, although the 24 mark is not very positive in that regard. The last thing I'll say, and then again, actually, I would turn it open to you, reluctance to make decisions. really hard to, it's a very dynamic time. There is no doubt. Coming out of COVID, we still, I don't think even GSA doesn't know exactly how much we as an agency need as far as space in the regions. But you must at least start to make these decisions. As you heard, I hope you watched the hearing where Commissioner Albert testified on July 13th on the GAO report. I mean, some of the, Mr. Maroney from GAO said, it is time for agencies to start making decisions. We cannot be in this perpetual, I just don't know. I don't know what we'll need. I don't know what my subunits need. It's time to make decisions. Time is ticking. We're about to go into FY24. It's time. It's time to start saving taxpayer dollars where we can and really, get a grip on the portfolio in these headquarters locations. But I would love to hear from you. And I see a hand. Is this appropriate?
Yes, this is totally
I'm
fine.
usually the rogue one on a panel.
Thank you. Barbara Reynolds with CFTC, and we have locations in region 2, 5, 6, and 11. 2, 5, and 6 are already complete. And so that's going to be a whole other thing because that started in 2020. We've done the renovations of the regional offices, and now we're coming up on headquarters, and we're coming into making new decisions based on the environment. And I'm frightened that we're going to end up going back to the regions again to start all over again. But to pile on to what you're talking about as far as decision making, that's my role, is to help those decisions along and have that data. So I'm glad to be here and hear about a lot of the tools that you have available. But one of the things that comes up, and I think I'm going to get a lot of support here, is storage.
Okay. Storage for
No,
what? Records?
Exactly.
Paper?
And
Excess furniture?
and excess furniture we have, and we've already had everybody coming along because it's going to be a whole new furniture situation. But one of our executives is like, we don't have a not enough storage problem. We have a too much stuff problem. He didn't really say stuff, but that's another point. The point is resources for that kind of thing, because yes, some of them are records and they do need to be kept and they do have, restrictions to them, but other things are just not enough tools to digitize things. And like you said, culture, get used to not having all of that filing paper area and space to work on secure paperwork and things like that. And I think it's just a statement that it's a mindset of, we're not going to work the same way as we always have, but are there, other than, ARA and restrictions like that, are there any other resources for assisting agencies with, okay, maybe you don't need as much space, but maybe you really don't need as much space because you don't really need all those big storage rooms?
So there are digitization vehicles that our sister organization can provide to you. I have personal experience with this, having moved our regional office about 7 years ago, where we digitized everything. It's a huge change management effort, but we don't even miss the paper now. And really, it's a reflection of what you're willing to do and how you embark on that change management effort. And it's as Melanie said, it's about culture. And I've seen agencies who were able to shed like a million and 1.2 million square feet and go into their headquarters location by changing workstation size, by digitizing, by moving, by changing their culture for their administrative team. So it starts with the top, and it's just over and over again. We had a team, we called it time to move, time to do everything. We had each organization digitized, had a nomenclature system. There's a whole process to this, and we can help you with this. And there's contractors out there that can do that and help you with it too.
So, there is a customer that has a unique mission. USDA has an aerial photography group where for decades they've flown planes and taken film of the landscape of the entire United States, originally for purposes of agricultural use, but has so many other uses beyond that. They have a facility in our Region 8, and now my brain is no longer United States geography, it's just GSA geography. I think it's actually Salt Lake in Utah, where they were storing these massive reels of film, and they were just anchored to this space because of that film that was decades and decades old, and it was part of the national treasure, quite frankly, because it's like going back in time and seeing what the landscape looked like from a urban development standpoint. So many uses for this information. We did exactly what Joanna mentioned. They were able to get out of that space, reduce their space by more than half, and not only have a modern office space that best supported their needs, but then digital access to those files, which is not only useful for their mission, but citizens across the country who now can access that information online. So a great example of how that done.
I mean, huge amounts of drawings that we have throughout GSA. We've been able to digitize and change the way our construction personnel, project management personnel work. I love when I go to agencies and they tell me they need 9x9 workstation for their project management people so they can lay out plans. Who's laying out plans? You know, who's not working on CAD and other digital media? You don't need that space for that anymore. And I think that's what some of our buildings are reflective of, of those bygone days. It is.
Anybody else want to respond here to what's challenging in planning your spaces? Yeah, back here.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Deirdre Jones. I'm with NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a part of the Department of Commerce. So I think it's not reluctance, but fear, right? So we step off the cliff and reduce our size, and then we might need this space again because our mission increases. And so then you have to ask for more space. You've already given it up. So you got to get another lease. So that worry, I have not been able to quell within NOAA, but I am trying to push a downsizing. Meanwhile, you get this memo after, we ripped the Band-Aid off and brought people back last year, 3 days a week into the office, unless you're
a week. Did you say 3 days a week?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Just.
I know, right? Coming off of COVID, and it was a huge, douse the cold water on people. So there are some waivers for the specific category of work that you do. So our contracting people said they could not keep staff anymore because they could go find any agency who would give them remote work, right? So waivers for that type of non-space related work, right? But at the same time, we have this memo that says go back into the office. And so I've got 3 days a week and space that accommodates that. And now I want to downsize, and I'm going to just say, we're going to downsize and we won't have space, but will we be then criticized for not having space for people to come back into the office 3 days a week, right? So it's that fear being contrary to the political guidance coming down, as opposed to not wanting to pursue reductions, massive reductions, and just not come back into the office anymore, right? So I just want to make a comment. It's not really a question. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I think that's really helpful insight. And I would just give a plug for flexible workspace that allows you to grow and contract. We did this in the judiciary when I was there. I did it with the staff, with space that I had at the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts to show judges and clerks, et cetera, what the workplace could look like for the next generation. I mean, people do not expect, I don't think, the next generation to have a giant office with a conference room in it. They want a touchdown space. They want flexibility. They want collaborative hubs. I mean, I could do the pitch for Chuck Hardy and the Will on the second floor, but I'm a really big believer in that because demountable walls are a heck of a lot cheaper to pull down or create than drywall. And so the more flexibility you give yourself as you're planning the future of what your workspace looks like, the more you can contract and grow. So just a thought. Thank you for your comment, though. Appreciate it.
I think it's a great one. I think that fear is real, and it's a sort of a cultural legacy, I think, of the federal government. I think it's something that we have the opportunity and the momentum to get over here now. And Nina talked a little bit yesterday, the commissioner talked a little bit yesterday about her experience working for Under Armour, and Under Armour having super trophy space that was flexible and adaptable to do all those things that Melanie just described, that they're using to attract and retain, again, this emerging talent that there's super competition for. And we have so much going for us as a federal government in attracting and retaining that talent from a mission perspective. I mean, I'm not going to knock Under Armour, but is it more exciting to work on like athletic gear or working to cure cancer? Or making sure that the food and drugs that people take are safe, or that the water is clean, or that justice is served, or that the border is secure and trade can flow across it. Like, if we can combine that mission with attractive space that's comfortable, safe, and conducive to the work, we'll get the best talent. I mean, salary aside, sure, there will be some that go another way, but we'll get the best talent and the people who are doing it for the right reasons. So I think that's the opportunity.
Yeah, then. Oh, go ahead.
I just want to say one thing. Hello, Deirdre. It's scientists can shed space too. We have great examples with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. NASA's looking at different ways to do space. So I know that sometimes the scientific community has an affinity towards their space, their offices, their labs, but we've seen some great savings with those agencies if you need examples.
We have a comment out here.
Good morning. My name is Robin Blackwell. I'm with DoD Navy. I'm out of Norfolk. And so basically I work with GSA and any Navy or Marine tenants that are in GSA leases. And I'm seeing some traction in with one of the leases. It was a 30-year lease in Norfolk Human Resources, and we were in the middle of doing a succeeding lease when COVID hit. And this is a tenant that basically did training for the civilians. You would go there for your pre-retirement courses, TSP, and et cetera. They had actually been in this lease for 30 years. And due to COVID, they were able to adapt with technology, doing virtual training, and they decided we don't need to pursue the succeeding lease. And so they pushed back in to the Norfolk Naval Shipyard to be able to go back and be with their tenant command there. So, I mean, that was a 30-year lease that we were able to break, release the space back to GSA. I'm also seeing traction. I'm working with the Marines in Indianapolis. They've been in the BMO Plaza. They were in like 90,000 square feet when COVID hit. They did not have any telework agreement in place. They did not have telework at all. And through COVID, they had to quickly implement a telework agreement. And through that, they relinquished 30,000 square feet of space. GSA and myself, we worked with them to push them to the Bean building, the federal building. And I think they're due to go in there in January, but they are now at 100% telework while they wait for the space to be built out. And I will say GSA has done a phenomenal job with the design of the space. I listened in on the calls with the design team, and they really was against leaving their Class A space. You know, they were in downtown Indianapolis, and it took some push to kind of get them to get on board with moving to the federal Bean building, but it's actually been a very successful project. And I can't wait to go there to actually see the end result. So there is agencies that are willing to either downsize or they're willing to change the way they think about how they work. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for those great examples of, being flexible in an environment where, we have space, but now we found that technology or our own innovation is able to kind of get us to either remote work or do our jobs more efficiently somewhere else and release these really long-term leases. I mean, 30 years is a very long time. And in one case, and in the other case, to move to the Emmett Beam building, which I think is phenomenal. Glad to hear that Region 5 is helping you out there in Indy, but just the idea is that we're utilizing our technology, our tools to be able to shed space where necessary. And I think those are great examples. I'd like to we encourage more of that as we kind of partner with you for your long-term needs.
Yeah, and the message and the story there is clear. Don't wait. If you see the opportunity for reduction, whether you're in the firm term or not, whether in an owned space or a lease space, don't wait. Let us know. And Joanna, I have to ask if you planted that question, that success story from Region 3.
What's the name? Was that a GSA lease in Norfolk? Because Norfolk is in my region. Good job, Region 3. Yay. Thank you for that.
So with these success stories, we've heard a little bit. Chad, I would like to hear from you a bit about how GSA uses your utilization information to make space decisions, right? So there's a lot of information out there across the regions, here at headquarters. So how do you use that to make decisions?
Yeah, it's again, back to that equation of supply and demand. We've got tremendous data on the supply side. We've got some data on the supply side on utilization. Most of that is around, our best data is around vacancy, and the GSA has an enviable vacancy rate of about 3%. If you're a commercial REIT, real estate investment trust, or a company that's doing business in this space, that'd be enviable. You'd be banking tremendous amounts of dollars, and you'd be able to reinvest that money into your inventory, which we can't do, but we want to be able to do. The missing piece of that equation is utilization, and we have some of it, but we don't have enough of it to take action the way that we want to across the entire enterprise. And when we partner and when we get that that intelligence on opportunities to reduce, that's when we have the real opportunity to mine value and get you the right space for your mission, but also save money in the process. I think Melanie's probably positioned to talk a little bit about that, about next steps for NCR. I don't want to put you on the spot, but like there are examples where we know that space, that we're sitting in too much space, but we want to cut through that Swiss cheese to make it work.
Well, one of the things, because I know we're getting close on time, is we're doing a study. We've contracted with Jones Lang LaSalle to do a study of the NCR inventory. And so headquarters agencies, you all, I think, have received notice that you're going to be interviewed, because we are trying to match the supply, as Chad said, with your demand. And where are those opportunities? Frankly, a lot of lease consolidation. I mean, NCR has been super focused on that for agencies. And I think even prior to COVID, we were doing great things to try and consolidate leases into headquarters locations. But that is going to just be another piece of data. This is all about data, and trying to just partner with all of you to determine what your culture, your need, your mission, and your space is to right size your demand within the supply we have. And I'm just going to put in one other plug. There are massive buildings in the National Capital Region that are not fully occupied. Okay, as we've talked about. Is consolidation with another agency a possibility? Why do we have a culture of this is mine? As I've said earlier, this is not to be shared. Is that really in the best interest of the taxpayer? I'm not sure. But these are the questions we want to engage with you in a collaborative way to discuss these things and put them on the table. We don't have the answers. I don't think you don't have the answers. Together, we can find the answers for what's best for you all and your needs.
That's right. Sometimes the solution is easy. If you've got space that you can give back, give it back.
Right.
Brian will dispose of it. We've got only 3% vacancy. That's
He's
right.
sitting
And-
here waiting to dispose of buildings, right?
Yes.
Well, we've had a lot of customer agencies, some way-at-home agencies who may not work with GSA a lot, kind of communicating offline that there's going to be a tranche of properties on the way, but then we don't hear anything. So I think, this reluctance to make decisions obviously is widespread throughout all types of agencies, but I think sooner or later, those decisions obviously need to be made, or they may be made from top down, and we don't have much choice about it. So lots to look forward to in the next few years.
There's an open secret where sometimes there's this unique scenario, this Goldilocks of events where even with GSA's lack of major capital dollars and availability of customer dollars to realize an opportunity, there are times when we can take an RWA from a customer agency that can be spent on things that GSA would traditionally fund, that GSA is supposed to be funding but can't because of constraints. And an agency can send that money via RWA, and then we can provide consideration through the form of reduced rent. It's not something that works all the time. It's not something that can work across the inventory. But if there are examples where money is the only thing that's holding back taxpayer savings and it makes sense to do, that's a scenario that we can utilize, and we've done it in a variety of circumstances. To talk again with your client executives, whether national or regional client executives, on opportunities that you see, but for lack of money, would be great for you and great for the taxpayer.
Okay, with 2 minutes left, I'm going to toss the final question to our virtual audience.
Okay, so this question came in thematically. There are several questions related to this topic, and we have a couple of our online folks who are commenting about organizational culture and dynamic leadership. So we had a first comment talked about that leadership really reinforcing a positive and collaborative culture, planning and communicating flexible but expected work schedules for employees so that we can help make those workplace decisions based upon how organizations need to work and serve their clients. And a related comment about organizational change. Now they're asking for some support that they might find from GSA. And the question is there a team within GSA to assist with the development of town halls to change mindsets of decision makers regarding how desk sharing and other arrangements are beneficial with creating federal government savings? Can cost benefit analyses be provided to agencies to help support decision making?
So there's a lot there. Maybe that's multiple questions, and that's why. Let me start with the notion of culture, and then I think other folks might want to talk about some of the tools for reductions and opportunities and value analytics. From a culture perspective, space is so important to the way that we operate with each other as humans. Technology the same, so important in terms of how we operate together. And I think there's been an emerging discussion about implicit and explicit bias. One of the things that I've observed about myself, and I'm trying to continually unlearn, candidly speaking, is that I interrupt women more than I interrupt men. Like, I've noticed this about myself.
Yes, we did too, Chad. No. I love Chad Gilchrist.
Joanna was she was sitting in the acting AC role for 6 or 7 months before I was, and I hope I didn't interrupt her. Something that I consciously am unlearning throughout the course of my professional life, but it's something that I never try to forget. The thing that I noticed was I did it less once we shifted to the virtual environment in the pandemic world with technology. And one of the things that I noticed, I won't mention the company, but I'm a voracious consumer of all news related to the future of work and return to office and real estate. I was reading about a CEO whose company I won't name, who was, going through this mandate exercise about talking about how people needed to be back in the office. And one of the things he missed about not being in the office was that he could interrupt people more. This was the benefit of being in the office, that he could interrupt people more. And I sort of matched that with my experience of trying to overcome biases. And there's something to culture that we've got to think about intentionally. as it relates to space, technology, and again, that emerging workforce. And our existing workforce, quite frankly. Like it doesn't have to just be the emerging workforce. It has to be, the workplace has to work for all of us. And to get there, we need to capture these tools, technology, and space, but we also need to think about ourselves. Or I'm going to think about myself. I hope others are as well. Think about my relationship with my colleagues and my peers, and think about the work of our institutions, and try to do better on all of those fronts. And then, of course, on the tools and analytics side, we mentioned some of those earlier. Joanna had her cheat sheet with the WIFM tool, federal co-working, fast track space, all sorts of opportunities. But the point is, check them out on our website, but also reach out. Don't hesitate, talk to your RCE, your national client executive, regional client executive, building manager, asset manager, planning manager. We're all positioned to help.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chad, Joanna, Crofton, Melanie, Brian. We really appreciate your time today. Give them a round of applause.